Welcome back to Talking Blarney. The news is out. It is harder to get ahead than ever before. It's impossible to buy a house, AI is taking all our jobs, and inflation is rampant. In short, we're financially cooked. Or are we? Historian, investor, and best-selling author Joseph Moore dived into the history books to uncover how the United States' current financial era stacks up against the past. He shares how Americans used to get rich and how you could still too. If you could like, comment, and subscribe, it would really help me grow the channel. Now, enjoy the conversation with Joseph Moore. Joseph Moore, welcome.
So glad to be here.
We're going to get right into it here. It's 2026. Everyone reputable on TikTok is talking about it, but is it harder to get ahead than it ever was before?
No, it's not. And that should not be heard by somebody as a middle-aged man telling the youngsters, it's so easy compared to when I was young. What I want people to understand is not how easy it is today, but how hard it used to be. Like, the fact that it's easier to get ahead today than it has ever been historically should tell you how hard getting ahead used to be. And yet, for 300 years of American history, there was no place statistically where it was easier to get ahead than right here. So every era of Americans, it was easier to get ahead compared to all their peers in the world, right? If you were leaving famine-plagued China to come to San Francisco, it's because it was a lot easier to get ahead in San Francisco than it was in famine-plagued China or Italy or Poland or Scotland or wherever. If we look back on their lives and compare it to our lives, it's never been easier to get ahead. One of the greatest predictors of upward mobility today is mobility. And if somebody who wants to chase a dream, if you want to get up and go where the opportunity is, it's never been easier. When the first time, about 100 years ago, the U.S. Army tried to get across the United States, like the U.S. Army, you kind of got to get out of their way if they say we're coming. It took the U.S. Army 62 days to go from one coast of America to the other 100 years ago. And I guarantee you could put everything you own into a U-Haul and be the other side of the country in 48 hours. So, like, your ability to get up and go, wages, believe it or not, are higher, adjusted for inflation. And people say, oh, that's great for the rich, but what about the poor? The bottom 10% of Americans earn more today than they did in the 1990s. In every single U.S. state, there is only one state where it's close to tied, and that's Michigan, because of all of those industrial jobs that left Michigan. But in every American state, the average bottom 10% makes about 20 to 30% more than they did when I was a high schooler. Wages are up. Now, there are difficulties, but we've faced all of those difficulties before. And we can learn from the past what our previous ancestors did to overcome things like a housing shortage and high housing prices, right? We have faced all of this before, but the wind is at your back more than you know.
If we were to paint a more accurate historical picture of what it was like getting rich in the United States, what would that painting look like?
So in the book, I talk about, like, there's kind of 25 lessons from history you can take away that kind of work in every era, 7 things to never do in any era. But I kind of boil this down to 5 principles, right? The first is you have to look at your financial life as solving someone else's problems. If I walk into Barnes & Noble and I close my eyes in the finance section and I pull a book off the shelf, I'm going to have a book that tells me about me and my problems and how to solve my problems. The problem with that is you don't get rich solving your problems. You cannot go broke solving your problems, right? Maybe you do have too many lattes or whatever it is, but that's about you and your problems. The real money is made solving somebody else's problems. And throughout American history, the way people really got ahead was by finding a way to solve someone else's problems and get rewarded for it. So that's the first thing, is where can you get paid the most to solve somebody else's problems? Number 2 is, which is talked about, was like mobility. Like, Americans used to be more mobile than we are today. 1 in 3 Americans changed addresses every single year in the 1800s. And in the 1950s, it was still 1 in 5. Today, it's 1 in 13. And a large portion of the 1 in 13 are retirees going to Arizona. They're done solving anybody's problems but their own. So if you want to actually get rich in American history, you had to go where the opportunity was. The next thing you have to do is, and I will say this works in every single era, is marriage. Like, the importance of marriage has been completely lost as a financial strategy. And I know that makes it sound like very non-romantic, but one of the largest predictors of financial success or failure was the quality of a marriage. Capitalism is just a team sport. You can do more with two than you can do with one. And then I'll just kind of round it out with finally believe that you can, right? Like optimism is wildly over rewarded in American history. The American system to this day rewards risk taking. It rewards people who are willing to risk failure because of the upside. And we've become way too risk averse in our society. It's actually never been safer to take risks in American society. Your house and your spouse can all be insured. If you fail, you can bounce back, which was not something you could always do. So taking the risk, focusing on quality relationships like marriage, solving other people's problems, moving where the opportunity is, and just finally believe that you can. Everyone is out there doom scrolling, telling you you cannot. And that means the pool of people willing to take the risk, willing to go where the opportunity is, willing to solve other people's problems gets smaller. The more people who listen to that, which makes your opportunities greater for going ahead.
Why don't you just kind of discuss a little bit of your background here? What do you do? How did you get studying some of the historical personal finance aspects, and how did you kind of land on this topic of how to get rich in American history?
By complete accident. Like I have failed upwards. I have never taken a business class in my entire life. How does that happen? All right, well, it's 2005. I'm getting a PhD in history, which is not a way to get paid in money, right? It's a way to get paid in prestige. Like academic professors don't make a lot of money. And I don't care because I never came from money. I'm from rural South Carolina. I used to live in a mobile home with a rotted out floorboard. Like money was an ambition I had because I didn't know anybody who had it. But I did love history, and I was kind of a history nerd kid, and I just kind of became this path like, oh, I'll be a history professor. It's 2005. Everyone says the lesson of history is clear. Renting is throwing your money away. My wife and I nod our heads, both graduate students, living on student loan money, and they let us use the student loan money to qualify for a mortgage, to borrow more money to buy a house, because that's what it is as bad as they say in the movies. Like, it was crazy. It's 2008, a few years later. Our church, friend at church, leads a personal finance class, a Dave Ramsey class. And I was like, I'm not going because, we're so smart. We don't need that. And he said, will you come just as like a personal favor? Because I don't want to have an empty room. So we go. We fill out a budget. And we're like, who gave us a mortgage? Like, what were we? What idiot signed the paperwork? Oh, we signed the paperwork, right? Like, what on earth? And so we put our house on the market. It sold on a Saturday. The next Saturday, our neighbor put her house on the market. It never sold. We were the last two people off the Titanic. And so 2008, the economy implodes, and we survived by sheer luck in 7 days. And I was like, oh, the historian in me turned on. Like, why did I believe what I was told? What were other Americans told? And how has it changed? And can we learn anything from that? Can we actually learn what worked, what didn't, how it changed? And it changed a lot. And so that just started me on a quest to research this. And about halfway through, I thought, okay, I'm kind of making a recipe book, right? Like a recipe of what other Americans did for their financial lives. So I'll try it out. Like, I'll eat my own cooking. And I would experiment with the various strategies from the past. And some of them were losers. Some of them were crazy, like buying land on the moon, which was a thing in the early space race days. People were like, oh, who's going to own the moon? Lunar land. I'm going to be the first. And people, but one thing led to another, and I started to realize, like, if you treat it like a business, solving someone else's needs, there's actually a lot of money to be made in the American economy. And one thing led to another, and I looked around, and to my great surprise, I was a multimillionaire. I was like, how on earth did this happen? I'm not supposed to be rich. I never wanted to be rich. I was experimenting with the stuff from the past, and that led me to be able to write this book.
I'm 34. And I remember I was in high school when the 2008 crisis kind of occurred, right? So, I mean, obviously it didn't hit me. I didn't have any assets at 16, luckily. But, it was such an impactful and shaping event for my generation specifically. But when you start uncovering the generations before us and kind of talking about the things that occurred to them, what were some of the challenges that, we as millennials probably often think about because we're far beyond it, but each generation faced its own challenges in wealth creation. So what were kind of some of the things that you uncovered every time you were researching the different generations of the United States?
What always worked was always changing. I think that's the first takeaway. It's like we have this idea that there's this, if we could study history, we'd know what really worked for everybody. And then and then everybody forgets and then we go all crazy and then the bust happens and we have to be shamed and remembered. No, actually, what people did to succeed in the past wasn't always what we would do today and vice versa. Um, and the other thing I take away from the past is that every challenge you face financially has been faced before by somebody else, a lot of somebody else's, and they figured out what to do so you can too. So like this idea that like no one's going to get ahead anymore. Okay, except for the fact where people thought that for 300 years. I say sometimes I can find people telling me the American dream is dead 300 years before I can find the phrase American dream, which only appears in the 1930s. But in the 1670s, this is 100 years before Hamilton will rap on Broadway. In the 1670s, the colonists of Virginia burned their capital to the ground because they said nobody gets ahead anymore. So this idea that you somehow were everybody else had it right and I came here at the worst possible moment. People have felt that way before, and they nonetheless found a way to persevere and succeed. So learning that these challenges have all been faced before, and I'll give you one specific example. We have a housing crisis right now. We really do, especially for New Yorkers, especially for people on the West Coast, especially for people in Denver, there's just states where it's worse than others. But it is not the first, and it is not even the worst housing crisis America has faced before. So if you go back to 1948, statistically, the housing crisis was twice as extreme as today. There's a young man who returns from World War II. He decides to run for Congress. The number one item on his platform for his first congressional run is housing affordability. His name is John F. Kennedy. Right? We have seen all of this before. We know the solutions. And I think that's what the history offers us, is a chance to kind of look back and realize, I'm not facing something that's so unique and I can get around it.
One of the particular groups that you call out a lot in the book, or had a whole chapter on, which I found was fascinating, is immigrants, right? So the United States is a nation of immigrants, and, we come from somewhere else. We always say Irish American or Chinese American or Japanese American. We came from somewhere else, but immigrants disproportionately succeed once they reach America. So why is that?
So whatever your thoughts on the politics of immigration, right, which let's call that a charged issue right now.
Just a little bit.
Put whatever side of it you're on to the side and just think about the history of it. And over again, the people who went from the farthest back to the furthest ahead were immigrants. And so this poses a historical question, why? Why is it that whether you're talking about immigrants from Scotland in the 1700s, or China in the 1800s, or Italy in the 1870s, or the Caribbean today, believe it or not, statistically, their upward mobility rates in every era are about the same, and they're always higher than native-born Americans. Why is that? And the answer is there are people are like, is it racial? Is it like this ethnic group or that? No. I can find all the things people say about ethnic groups today, about other ethnic groups then. So it's actually about immigrant financial strategies. There are financial strategies peculiar to immigrant groups that help them go farther faster than people who've been born here for 5 generations who don't feel the need to work nearly that hard or take nearly that much risk or coordinate nearly that well. And so there are things you can learn from immigrant families, whether or not you are one or not, that correlate highly to working class success becoming middle and upper middle class success. So I'll give you an example. Immigrant families were the most likely to rent out rooms in their houses. Now, there's a whole strategy around that today on the internet called house hacking. And there's whole websites. So the way to get ahead is to you buy the rental property and then you live in it, you rent out the other units and all these things. And people are they've discovered the key to getting ahead. I'm like, guys, immigrants were doing that for 300 years. They would write about it in Polish and send letters. So you're in Minnesota, right? There would be family letters back to Sweden and Norway, these little pockets of immigrants from Scandinavian countries that populated Minnesota and Wisconsin. And these families would send letters back here's how you do it in America. You get some land. It's Chicago. Chicago was ground zero for this. You get some land, you buy a house, and the first thing, because you got a mortgage, the first thing you do is rent out the rooms. So immigrants were willing to hustle in ways native-born Americans found weird then and now, and that it accounts for a large part of their fast upward mobility.
One of the things about immigrant groups that is, significant through history is that they often, once they had the blueprint and they sent it back, you had to often repeat the same ethnic groups kind of repeat the same things, right? So Irish Americans came over and they were police officers, right? That was a very recurring thing. Chinese, when they'd come over, they'd basically go, hey, this is how you cook Chinese food. And then they sent them off to every small town in the United States. So there's a whole industry of Chinese restaurants.
And laundromats, too, by the way.
Yes.
It's like the Asian Americans, especially the Chinese, figure out that there's a whole market for laundromats. So this is in the 1800s. And the reason that a lot of laundromats are still immigrant owned to this day is there was just a higher ROI. If you're willing, it's a steamy hot work. It's not easy to work in a laundromat, but like there was just a higher ROI. And so by the time in the 1950s, some Chinese families are in the middle class, their kids go to college and they're surprised to find they went to college, they got the middle class accountant job, and they're actually making less than mom and dad. And so, like, it was just like they were rewarding careers that other people weren't willing to go into.
One of the things that we talk about for wealth creation right now is investment in the stock market. Stock market's hitting all-time highs. Elon Musk is hitting trillionaire status off the companies he owns. Has stocks always been the path to wealth and riches?
No. And that is not the popular message. Because if you go into any financial advisor today, they will slide you what I call the chart. And I just call it the chart because the dates change, but the takeaway never does. The first time it was handed to me, so I'm about 15 years ahead of you, right? The one that was slid to me was like just $10,000 invested in 1929 at the height of the stock market. Because the whole point was like the Great Depression, the crash is not something to be scared of, right? Even $10,000 invested in 1929 at the height of the 1929 bubble, reinvesting all dividends would today be worth $10 million. And the guy sits back like ready for me to be amazed at like the power of compounding interest. And I severely disappointed him. I was like, wait a minute. Houses did not cost $10,000 in 1929. You mean to tell me that this person lost 80% of their life savings, lived through the Depression, fought Nazis, feared nuclear Armageddon, cried when Ross and Rachel got back together, never once touched that money? That's not real life. So first and foremost, just like the idea that you would compound all that wealth and never touch it is kind of a mirage created to sell you on. And look, compounding interest is real. I'm not saying it's not real. Of course, the math is the math. But in real life, very few people are able to live a life where all this money just sits on the side and is never touched. More than that, if I go back farther than the 1920s, in fact, as late as the 1950s, only 10% of Americans owned stock. If I go to the 1890s, 1% of American families owned stock because you couldn't buy an S&P index. The reason you couldn't buy it is because it didn't exist. You would have had to have bought, there was something called a minimum lot size. You basically had to buy 100 shares whenever you bought. Now, there was a thing called odd lots. Put that to the side. It's A, it's not efficient. B, it wasn't easy to get. But there was a 100 share buy-in. So if you wanted to buy the S&P 500 or the Dow Jones Industrial Average, you would have had to buy 100 shares of every company in the index. That would have been $1 million. $1 million in the 1920s. It's like $12 million today. So the only people who could buy stocks for the long run were already rich. The average person couldn't do it. So what does that mean for today? It is easier today than it's ever been to invest in the stock market. You can do it for relatively zero fees. But you actually have to use all that money to compound and not spend it. So can you get rich in the stock market? Sure, if you're willing to be very, 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 very patient. And not everybody is, and not everybody can. I mean, like if your kid ends up in the ICU, you'll spend whatever it takes to make sure they come out of there, alive. And I know families that have done. My own family did this. My brother was in the NICU, and my dad had to basically drain his entire savings and retirement because the insurance company wouldn't cover it. Like, compounding gets interrupted all the time. So yes, you can invest in the stock market, and yes, you can get rich that way, but it's not the easiest. It's not even the best way to get rich.
Well, I guess that leads to the question of what is the best way to get rich?
The single most likely path to getting ahead in America is an outsized investment on something that has a disproportionate upside. And a lot of times that thing is yourself. Now that sounds very self-helpy and guru-y, but I'm being honest here. The historical record is pretty clear. People who are willing to invest in something that will have an outsized payout, whether that's a small business, which is one of the common ways people did it, was they would build a small business that they would sell at the end, and they would get most of their payout at the end, not throughout the process. This is, by the way, still the case today. We have more millionaires, and almost 10% of Americans today are millionaires. 10%. And a lot of those, and especially a lot of the deca millionaires, which we also have more than we've ever had, are small business owners. So they took a bet on themselves. They built something through and scaled it and made it valuable and sold it off. And that's one of the most common ways. The other way, it's not just small business though. The other way is you take a bet on yourself and your career. So if you bring me a young person who says, hey, I've got this $1,000, what should I invest it in? I'm like, probably the best answer is you. Like, what is the skill set? What is the training? What is the certificate? What is the thing that if you could do it in your industry, what is the tuition-based program? Like, you're going to make more money being a dentist and investing those outsized returns than you are being, a middle manager at Target and trying to invest the extra couple of $1,000s a year that you get. Like, there's just, you want to build a career where there's just more money to invest and save. And so whether it's in a small business or whether it's in your career, investing in the thing where the outsized big payouts come at the end is usually the path to wealth that most Americans took.
That scorecard that we use is often net worth, right? So you're kind of, putting it towards the end for the payoff. It's kind of tough, but the way kind of people calculate is this is what my net worth is at 20 and 30 and 40 and 50. Is that a good way to measure how successful we are in the wealth accumulation game?
Yeah, I don't think George Washington knew what his net worth was. Like so the full idea of net worth is fairly new. It starts to come up as a very technical commentary on businesses, like the net worth of the businesses in the 1800s, early 1900s. It doesn't get turned on like the individual as an idea until the middle of the 20th century. So let's just start out with like a whole lot of people who got really, really, really rich didn't know what their net worth was. Because most people talked about worth, like, we talk about millionaires like Rockefeller, and just in terms of all the things that they owned. Nobody was like backing off the debt burden on that. I don't think net worth is a particularly helpful idea for the average American. Well, a lot of this idea of like paper net worth is misleading. What you really want is what in the 1800s was called an estate worth, meaning of all the things that you own, how much money do they make you? And that is all, like any Jane Austen novel, that's the concept. Like all this farmland you have, or this business you own, or these stocks that you have, how much do they actually make you every year that you can spend? And that is the real question. And so for people who are like kind of pursuing like the building out of net worth or financial independence, really the only question is how much money does it throw off every single year? And that's how much you could live on every single year from that money. And if that is growing, that's what you're after. Can you keep growing? Now, net worth will be a byproduct of doing that. But putting your focus on the net worth, like you can have I know some people who are worth millions of dollars who live paycheck to paycheck. I mean, like know these people intimately because they have a big, big house and they have the vacation home and the boat and the things. And those things are worth a lot and cost them a lot. So net worth is not a good, accurate measure of how you're doing financially.
It's interesting because Robert Kiyosaki, the author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, he famously says that your house is not an asset. And the reason being is that it doesn't produce any cash flow to you. Do you think that's an accurate statement? And, is there some caveats we got to put to home ownership?
I'm probably, of all the academics in the world, I'm probably the most lenient on financial gurus like Kiyosaki and Dave Ramsey. Like there's an academic paper in every single academic discipline making fun of these people, right? Making fun of the gurus that everybody listens to. And my take on the gurus, specifically Kiyosaki, is actually most people don't read them and do absolutely everything they say. They get like, think about every book you've ever read. And if I asked you about it, you could maybe remember one or two things. And that would be doing pretty good. Because there's some books that people ask me like, oh, you read this book, what's it about? I'd be like, I don't really remember. That was a lot of years ago that I read that book. So, what did most people take away from Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad Poor Dad? Not all the details of the book. And that's exactly what most people took away was, oh, my house actually costs me money. And if I want assets that kind of lead to me going ahead, I need assets that actually produce money. If that's all you took away from Rich Dad Poor Dad, that's not so bad. So, is your house an asset? Well, it depends on what are we doing here. Is it, from an economist perspective, it's what's called owner equivalent rents, meaning if I have my house and it's free and clear, what could I rent it out for? I'm basically living without that expense, therefore it is an asset. Okay, that's fine. But my house costs money every time my wife binge watches HGTV, right? Like every time somebody gets a wild hair about what the new thing is, I got to spend money on it. Every time a kid, pulls something off, the toilet paper hanger is now dangling from the wall. It's costing me money. And so thinking that I'm rich because I have this nice house isn't a particularly healthy way to think about getting ahead. And I do think that Kiyosaki is right to explore that. And I think people who take that away actually get a good, useful lesson. I'm not saying the house doesn't have value. I'm just saying that I can't tap that value till I sell it or until it's paid off and I live in it rent free. So putting money on an expensive house because it seems like it makes you rich is not necessarily a way to get rich.
One of the things you explore in your book is the tension between the financial guru and the academic. I think everybody who's maybe interested in personal finance probably kind of ends up in a certain camp, a guru's camp, and kind of, this person's got most of it, and then the academics kind of sneer at the gurus as maybe unsophisticated or they don't understand the math or whatever it might be. Can you kind of explore that dynamic between, what do the gurus get right? And then what do the academics get right and each of them get wrong?
Thank you. So this is one of the things I try. I have a whole chapter on this in the book, like the academics versus the gurus, right? And my argument is the nerds are actually losing pretty badly, and I'm on the nerd team, right? So like if anybody's going to be sympathy to team nerd, it's me. But the reality is, if I show you, and I showed this in the book, if I show you one of the standard personal finance equations in academia, there's not a grandmother a lot. Well, I mean, there are some, but like most, grandma can't follow this, right? This is way too complicated. It works on the spreadsheet. Life isn't on a spreadsheet. I have yet to find an academic equation that models a midlife crisis or a child with special needs. And most of your financial life is going to be lived in between those kinds of moments for which there is no equation. And when those things happen, you don't need Professor X from the finance department. You need somebody who can help you make a series of real-time decisions, that factor in just way too much that you can't actually do the arithmetic for it because it has marriage quality in it. It has kids' ages in it. It has, does your boss seem like he's in a bad mood today in it? All right, it has aging parents in it. And what you need is some common sense rules of thumb because you're going to be able to remember those and act on those and come back to those. And that's what gurus are for. And the really best gurus, the ones at the top, I'm not talking about TikTok influencer bros, okay? I'm talking about there's a Darwinian model of gurus in that for them to be truly successful for over, say, 10 to 15 years, people have to be able to follow their rules of thumb for 10 to 15 years and not get wiped out. Because if everybody who does what you say to do gets wiped out, you don't have followers anymore. You have an SEC investigation, right? But if you have people who are doing what you say and it's working, then something about those rules of thumb play out in the real world. And you actually, because the American economy is so big, so broad, and there's so many different ways to succeed, it doesn't just take one way. You can do what Dave Ramsey says and get ahead. You can do some of what Robert Kiyosaki says and get ahead. Well, do all of it. Just be my personal take on it, right? He has a higher debt appetite than I would want to have. And this whole deal of like, if I want to be so broke, I want to be so in debt that if I go broke, it's the bank's problem. Listen, most Americans are never going to get so big that their debt is the bank's problem, right? It's going to be your problem. So I would caveat a lot of what he says, but I think the rules of thumbs that gurus generally give are usually good enough. And good enough in the American economy that has created more wealth than any economic engine in the history of the world, it's pretty good.
I think one of the concerns people have with gurus is there's a bit of a survivorship bias. right? Is they actually made the money, right? They fell through. But, if Robert Kiyosaki went broke at 35 and also went broke at 37 and 39, and you never would have heard of it. But an academic at the same time doesn't maybe always build a multi-million-dollar business. So in a way, they haven't like taken that knowledge to practical use. So is there kind of some tension there too? Is like, hey, they're both flawed in some aspects, would you say?
Oh, of course. I mean, look, there's no perfect guide to anything in the world of personal finance anyway, right? And so, um, I think let me kind of give a solid to the professors, but then also kind of needle them a little bit. The professors are absolutely right to point out that, and I talk about this in my book, like this is one of the lessons of history. What always worked was always changing. If you do what Robert Kiyosaki did, move the dates around by 10 years, he's an absolute failure. But sometimes the right strategy hits in the right way at the right time. Go to Dave Ramsey. Sometimes in American history, doing what Dave Ramsey said is the absolute smartest thing you could possibly do. And there's other times you would have spent so much time paying off relatively low debt that you would have missed one of the biggest economic explosions upward. So this is not about Dave Ramsey, but there's a guy named Larry Burkett, who was a kind of the Dave Ramsey before Dave Ramsey, a very anti-debt guru. And he predates Ramsey. In fact, Ramsey read a lot of his material to kind of come up with his ideas. Burkett's book called The Coming Financial Earthquake was so popular, it was read on the floor of the House of Congress when they were debating 1990s tax reform. And if you had done what he said to do, which was get out of all debt, avoid stocks, everything was about to implode, you would have missed one of the largest stock market booms in human history. And it wouldn't have been a good strategy. Now, so strategies are context and time dependent. So that's what the gurus would be able to get right, is to say not everything works in every era at every moment. Now, that said, gurus are good at pointing out what works on paper in retrospect. But like living in the real world where you have to take risks and see where those risks pay out is not their forte. I had somebody needle me. So for your audience who won't know this, after the 2008 financial crisis, I went back into the real estate market based on the lessons of history and said, I think this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and I'm going to use it as an experiment, which went wildly beyond what I had thought it would do. I almost went broke, and then it bounced back. And somebody basically said, one of these academics said, well, of course you got rich in real estate after 2008. Anybody could have gotten rich in real estate after 2008. To which I replied, how much money did you make? Well, I didn't do that because I was okay, so you didn't take the risk, but it was obvious. It wasn't obvious. Trust me, you go around 2010, 11, 12, 13, you could find properties on sale for crazy prices. You could not find anybody to lend you the money because everybody was terrified. Like, we just got destroyed. Nobody wanted. So it isn't always clear in the moment what the right plays are. And so most academic researchers are basically pointing to a past where they know the outcomes and telling you that that's what makes them so smart. And I'm like, it's in the real world, you're in the fog of war. You don't really know what's going to happen next. And so risk-taking in real time it boils down to some common sense principles, less than equations.
I think that dovetails into the topic you had in your book, which is slow time versus fast time. Can you elaborate on that, what you mean in terms of investing?
A lot of personal, financial advisors have reached out to me. This is the concept they love the most in the book because I think it intuitively makes sense to them. Warren Buffett, there's a quote going on the internet right now today. I think it released like yesterday in some interview he did, where he said, there's times in my career where I had more opportunities to grab in the market than I could ever dream of because it was all right there for me. And he said, then I would go years, decades, where you would struggle to find one good investable idea. And that's kind of the idea of slow time and fast time. Most of financial time is slow, and then everything happens all at once. The problem with financial history is that it's very boring to write stories about the slow time. And so if you've even thought about financial history, you've probably thought about it in terms of a book or a movie about fast time. And it's 2008, it's 1929, and everything, and all the smart people saw it coming, and all the rest of us lost our shirts. And you're like, here's the problem with that. Those histories are not written to teach you what to do with your money. They are written to entertain you. They are murder mysteries. You are supposed to yell at the screen, "He's behind you. The subprime mortgage blender is behind you." Like, you're supposed to be like thrilled and excited by these histories. They don't teach you what to do with your money. Most of the financial decisions you will make will be in slow time, and they will get stress tested in fast time. By the way, slow time is very loud, not quiet. So one of my favorite examples to do with this is I will show people when I'm I'll do like public presentations or give a talk or something, or a speech, and I'll show people headlines from the New York Times, and one headline will say basically recession imminent, and the other one will say no recession in outlook or something like that, and I'll say, okay, these headlines are 3 months apart in the same year in the same newspaper. Now, guess the year. And people will say 2008, 2007, 1929, 1928. It's like 1953. Can you tell me anything other than the Korean War ending that happened in 1953? No, because it was a boring year. But if you were living through 1953, which historically is about as boring a financial year as we've had, it sounded crazy. Like, it's about to crash. It's about to boom. But we look back and go, oh, it's just normal. And so your life is probably mostly lived in financial slow time, normal time. But that doesn't mean people aren't telling you everything's about to go crazy. You have to drown out that noise and know that fast time will come. You'll probably see it coming when it does. And there will be opportunities presented to you to go broke or to get rich in those times that will come very fast and furious. But they're rare, and you can't live your whole life waiting for them. You have to live in the slow time.
It's hard to, we like to think it's a very mathematical and consistent formula where it's like, okay, if I slice off, 2%, 5%, 10% into investments which is a good process, right? You put that every month in your budget into investments, you should probably come out ahead or do very well.
A habit of savings is invaluable. Yes.
Exactly. But in a way too, it's hard to kind of validate in those slow times. You need to gather a bunch of kindling and then you got to deploy it well, right as fast times kind of hit. So there's a saying which is like, there's decades of nothing happening and years where 100 or decades occur.
Yeah, decades can occur. You can have a whole decade of financial returns within a few weeks. And by the way, this is not like rambly, like navel gazing. Benoit Mandelbrot did the math on this. Like, we've had the math on this for decades. Statistically, you'll have decades of slow time where volatility just kind of stays in a range. And then out of nowhere, 10 years of financial time will occur in a few months. And sometimes it's to the upside, sometimes it's to the downside. But it's like, it just goes crazy. I talk about this in the book. I call this like, when it's almost like a meth addict suddenly becomes a superhero. It's like there's this timeless thing that's not really going anywhere. And out of nowhere, it sobers up and just leaps tall buildings in a single bound. And that's kind of the way financial history works. But that's not the way we teach or talk about financial history. And so, yeah, learning how to manage the slow time is important. And fast time rewards concentration on the upside and the downside. So it will crush you if you're concentrated the wrong way, and it will wildly reward you if you are concentrated in the wrong way. So you think about post-COVID, right? The post-COVID real estate price increases. It's a housing crisis if you're on the wrong side of it. If you owned real estate in that moment, you got rewarded for that concentration. The single largest, fastest reward for owning real estate in American history. Like, now, outside of like pockets of San Francisco and Chicago when they were booming, but like nationwide, we've never seen prices do that in such a short period. And people started to think that was normal. And I've had to tell other real estate investors that the cycle we're in right now, this is normal. This is a normal real estate market in terms of price, sales, all those things. But that was fast time. And you're not gonna catch it again. Like, you just have to understand it's gone. And so you don't chase fast time. But fast time rewards or pains concentration. Slow time rewards, to your point, Kindle building. Like, doing things that steadily spread out well over time.
When in terms of habits, you're trying to do that consistent saving. It's often the rules of thumb is you consistently save and you diversify, right? That's the path to wealth, because a little bit every month going into a diversified bucket, But you talk about that concentration, and people like, let's say, Warren Buffett. He actually made most of his wealth on like Coca-Cola, Apple, and American Express. Right. And what it was is when he took his bets, he took big bets on those and they paid off massively. So, what is it about concentration that is really the key to unlocking getting rich?
So let's understand here that what we're talking about is so one of the things that's happened in our generation, our lifetime, is that retirement savings and getting rich have been collapsed into one idea. And in previous generations, that would have never made sense to people. Retirement was never a way to get rich. It was a way to hoard resources for the day you were too old to work. So what's happened is because the retirement industry has gotten so big, and the stock returns have been like a historic bull run. People have gotten rich with their retirement savings, and we've assumed that must be how people got rich. No, that's very, very, very new. For most people, the way you got rich was that you concentrated on a handful or even one outsized bet that you had some control over. Now, there's the key. Not taking out a mortgage on your house and buying Bitcoin with it. It's not, you have zero control over the price of Bitcoin. That's gambling. We're not talking about gambling. We're talking about people who decided, I believe there is such a high upside to this investment now that I'm going to concentrate on that upside. Andrew Carnegie, who was like, knew something about how to get from the very bottom to the very top, like goes from a poor immigrant kid from Scotland to one of the richest men in the world, said, everybody says don't put all your eggs in one basket. And he said, I tell you, put all your eggs in one basket and then watch that basket. Like actively engage in that basket, build a business, build a career. P.T. Barnum, the circus mogul who knew like how to separate fools from their funds, he said, when a dentist hears he can make money doing literally anything other than drilling teeth, he'll lose all of his money trying. And there is just something about this idea that I want to make money diversified, but that's not how you make big money. You make money concentrated. And over again, the people who concentrated on a business, on a career, or in Warren Buffett's case, on a handful of investments where he genuinely believed he had bought at a price where the upside was so high to the upside that there would be reward in the long run. That's who actually wins. Now, that is not telling people to go out on their Robinhood account and, bet everything they have on that Midwestern utility company your friend just told you about. That's gambling. But the people who take the risks where they have some level of control over the outcome, that's who really gets ahead in America for most of history. The idea of slowly investing your retirement funds to wealth is pretty new.
Does that mean that passive income is kind of a myth?
It's not a myth. In fact, it used to be more real than it is. And the reason for that is inflation. So if I take you to 1912, Babe Ruth doesn't quite play for the Yankees yet, but we're getting close to that era, right? A gallon of milk costs 24 cents a gallon. If I go back in time 100 more years to 1812, Napoleon rules France, and a gallon of milk is 24 cents a gallon. There's no inflation in America for 100 years. There's some deflation and coming back, but there's no inflation. And then World War I, the Federal Reserve, and the income tax all happen in the same span. And inflation goes from 0% to 8%, 18%, 17%, 15%. Like prices doubled in 5 years. If I'm in 1912 and I hit 5% safe passive income from a bond or from a stock dividend or rental property, that's a really good, safe way for grandma to sit by the fire because it's 5% against 0% inflation. But once you run those 5 years and prices double, suddenly everybody who had assumed passive income was the way to wealth got destroyed. And so the reason passive income is not as real as it used to be is because inflation erodes so much of it. If you want passive returns, passive meaning like you literally do nothing, the money just comes to you, then your returns are pretty meager against inflation. And it's kind of hard to live on. You're going to almost inevitably, unless you build such a big nest egg that you don't have to drain it, you're going to end up draining down your principal. So passive income used to be real. John Maynard Keynes had an essay called The Murder or the Euthanasia of the Rentier, which is basically the person who lives on passive income.
Talk about our early clickbait title.
Yeah. The murder. Who murdered passive income? Who done it? Who done it is inflation. And so what we have today, because of the way the stock market is structured, is instead of giving dividends. Dividends are now they're about to hit less than 1% of the S&P 500 is the returns. They're on the verge of 1%, lowest ever. The real return is from price increase. Well, price increase is speculative, right? The price can go up, the price can also go down. So now you're not getting passive returns, you're getting speculative returns. And those are two different things. So it's fine. It's the system we're stuck with, but like just understand that that's not really the passive income of old. It's speculative income.
So one of the things we haven't touched on yet, which is debt. I definitely grew up kind of in that Ramsey school of things, hearing that debt is bad. And, when I graduated college, paid down the car debt, paid off the student loans as quickly as possible, and then kind of kickstarted the investing scenario there. But the individuals that get rich like to use debt. They like to leverage debt a lot and take big swings with it. Is debt a good or a bad thing?
It depends on the kind of debt. And so let's not make debt one thing. Let's understand that debt is multiple things. Let's just break it down to three basic categories. There's debts of desperation, which have been around forever. The bankruptcy records of the 1840s show that the number one reason, one of the top reasons people would declare bankruptcy was medical debt. So we've always had, those moments when you get wiped out for terrible reasons and debt becomes the solution. That's bad in every era. But let's put that to the side because it's not really that's not a financial strategy anybody's going to have. Then there's debts, what I call debts of dumbness. You are not going to get ahead in life sitting on a couch you are paying 17% interest on, complaining about how nobody gets ahead, right? It's just watching a TV that you also bought on a payment plan. That's not the path to wealth. So in that regard, anti-debt, people who are warning you against consumer debt are very wise because Americans there's kind of a peasant mentality about debt in America. It's like, there's kind of two things you can do with it. Number one is you can say, hey, I'm never going to get ahead anyway. Nobody gets ahead, so I might as well use debt to kind of enjoy the things of this life now. That's a very peasant way to think about debt in the sense of like, I'm not going anywhere, so what do I care? It's kind of financial nicotine. It just, it just makes you feel a little better when you drag on it. The other way is to say, hey, kick the nicotine habit, get out of debt. You may not get rich, but at least you won't be poor like the guy sitting on his borrowed couch, right? And so that's you talk about you're raised with like a Ramsey mentality. I was raised in that on the nth degree. We didn't need Dave Ramsey to tell us to avoid debt where I came from. My grandfather was terrified of debt. My grandfather drove the most rickety, beat up car because he was under no circumstances going to have a car payment. He bought a house on a mortgage. He paid it off in 6.5 years. My grandmother said he was obsessed with paying that thing off. She would wake up in the middle of the night and find him like jotting down like at 2 a.m. like, how can I find a way to pay this house off? So that's the other side. Is like I can kind of see a life from where I am. Where I don't owe for the car. I don't owe for the house, and that's great. And that's kind of where the Dave Ramsey kind of school of thought would be. It's like get out of debt and then save and invest the rest. The reality is there's a third kind of debt, and that's strategic business debt, where you leverage. What I tell people is debt does not make you rich. Debt never made anybody rich. Opportunity makes you rich. And when opportunity comes along, debt will allow you to grab as much of that opportunity as you can manage. And the as much as you can manage part is important. You can't manage all the debt. And I talk about in the book how I got out way over my skis, way too much debt. There was opportunity everywhere, and I could see it, and I grabbed too much of it. In essence, right? And I got in trouble and had to like unwind a lot of that. But you can grow exponentially if you grab as much opportunity as you can, and debt can allow you to do that. And so most of the business people that I interviewed for the book, most of the dead business people that I read the biographies for the book and their records for the book used debt strategically to get ahead. By the way, back to Warren Buffett. One of the secrets to his success is that nobody talks about. Everybody talks about what a great stock picker he is, how he invests for the long term, how he's just smart and witty and stays in Oklahoma and eats at McDonald's. What people don't talk about is the fact that his average leverage ratio on a stock buy is $1.7 of debt to every $1 of equity. Geico, he owns Geico. And it's owning Geico that allows him to go borrow a bunch of money from that insurance pool that is also a large part of the reason Berkshire Hathaway is so successful. Because he strategically leverages debt. And most of the richest Americans in history did that. So debt is a complicated story. It's not an either or. It's perfectly fine. If folks say, I don't want debt, trust me, I wake up every single day and think, God, I just wish I could pay off my mortgage. I just wish I could pay off my mortgage. Here's the crazy part. I actually could. And I have to stare at the math every single month and go, I just make more money not paying this thing off. So like my personal cultural instincts are to avoid debt at all costs. And yet without debt, I wouldn't be sitting where I am now. So it's a balancing act and you have to learn. It's best if somebody can mentor you in it. But debt is a path strategically that many people have used to get ahead.
People that get wealthy are often very levered in debt, and their risk tolerance are a little higher. It's almost a self-selection bias, right? I often kind of think is the people that go really hard into like entrepreneurship is like they have that risk-taking gene, and it's probably better that their risk-taking gene is funneled towards, like creating a great business than it is to maybe jumping a motorcycle over a ravine or something like that.
Yeah.
That risk
Evil
is inherent.
Knievel rewards capitalism a little better than actually doing the Evil Knievel act. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little more productive, but as somebody who's maybe, let's say, the average individual, less risk averse, they're looking at the game right now and they go, hey, the game seems to be kind of risked in favor or kind of set up in favor of these people that are risk takers. And they seem to get bailed out 100 times out of 100 times, but then I get sick once and I get screwed over. Is this kind of a fair, picture of what it's like?
That's a really great question and a profound one. And so I will probably give you a lesser answer than the question was profound. I think one of the things that happens to a lot of people is they take one risk in their life, it doesn't work out, and they're just devastated by it. And especially if you're like, I think you and I come from similar kind of cultures of like risk aversion, and it's not really it's not debt and risk taking not celebrated where I was raised. I was raised in rural South Carolina. There was a reason that we'd been there since the 1700s and nobody had gotten rich, right? Like nobody had taken the risks, or if they had, it hadn't worked out. And so I think one of the things that happens to folks is if you take one risk and it doesn't work out, it's easy to just feel like this whole system doesn't work. I know I tried. Well, the problem with that is capitalism is kind of a shots on goal system. It's a basketball system, right? Whereas I think Americans tend to think of it as a baseball thing. Like if I swing and I miss, I only get 2 more and I'm out. But risk taking is more of almost like a habit and an exercise. Like once you've taken one, can you take the next one? And can you take the next one? And eventually, by the way, you will fail. So some people will get unlucky enough to get successful on the first one and think it's them and that it'll always work. Doesn't always work. Plenty of people who get rich on their first bet go off and do the second thing and go broke again. Like, it's a tragic example. There's a famous trader in the 1920s named Jesse Livermore, and he's like wildly famous. It's like this just risk appetite for days. Money doesn't really exist for him. It's all numbers. He doesn't care how much debt he's in, and he just makes huge returns until he doesn't. And he ends up like going so broke that he dies, basically. Like there's plenty of people who take risk, win, and then lose later. Now, what am I trying to say? I think the muscle and the habit you've got to build is a risk-taking muscle, because it is an unnatural act for folks like you and me who don't have that risk tolerance to take the risk. And yet there's reward on the other side of that risk. We're not talking about blind risk. We're not talking about gambling. We're not talking about, wagering on Kalshi. We're talking about taking an actual risk to build something in the world that could have an outsized reward. Not all of them pay out. That's why they're called risks. But you're in the nation in the world and the time in human history when the payouts are the highest and the most common. So I think that's my take on that, is like you got to get the habits of thinking about it as shots on goal, because it's easy to have a failure and feel like it's complete and total failure and not realize like actually most of the people who succeed, they had failures too. You just don't see them.
One of the things for individuals that get rich is the movement. And you kind of touched on this in the beginning of the show, is that they often went to where the opportunity was. In parts of the United States, I'm from what you would consider the Rust Belt up there. And it is kind of, there is maybe a negative thought process of like, hey, all the opportunity dried up and got shipped overseas. And so, we got screwed. But you go look down in places like Texas and Florida and Tennessee, those places are absolutely booming right now. What is the argument to you should be kind of picking up and kind of going to where the opportunity is if you're wanting to achieve a certain level of wealth?
This is an opinion that gets me a lot of let's call it warm opposition from folks, because there is this sense that, like, how dare you say that this town that my family's been in for X amount of generations, and I understand. My family arrived in the backcountry of South Carolina in the 1770s and never left. I understand, right? Like that makes sense to me. And yet, somewhere in your family is somebody who said, it's not working for us here. We have to get up and move. And that is why your family is where they got to be where they are, is that somebody took the risk. Does that still pay out today? And by the way, you talk about the Rust Belt. Like, I'm from the pre-NAFTA South. NAFTA hit us, like, and I've talked to economist friends who are like, oh, this is overstated, and the GDP metrics show. I understand that the GDP metrics showed that America boomed after. I'm just telling you that all the jobs left our towns, right? And so I totally get it. However, statistically, not only do people who leave their home state, I'm talking about just the United States. So let's talk about immigrants within the U.S. Like, you're an immigrant from Indiana to Texas, all right, whatever it is. People who leave their home state make more money over the course of their lifetimes. People in California today who leave California for the Texas, Oklahoma, those kind of areas, they almost immediately start saving $500 to $600 more a month, and statistically leap in their chances of home ownership. Not only that, the children of families who move out of state earn more than their peers over the course of their lifetimes. So not only do you stand to make more money by leaving, your children stand to earn more money by leaving. And by the way, that doesn't just mean moving to Texas, right? There's plenty of booming economic hubs in the Midwest. They just may not be the same towns they used to be in the Midwest, right? And so people who get up and go where the opportunity is are the people who earn the rewards from taking that risk. And that gets back to what we were talking about. That is a kind of risk taking. That is a kind of betting on yourself. That isn't starting a small business in your town. That is getting up and going where the businesses are employing people for better wages and more home ownership in another town. And it might not be pleasant. And my wife and I have been married for we're not quite 25, I think we're 23 years of marriage. We have moved, I want to say 19 times. That is insane. Trust me. Like, nobody is better at going to the liquor store for free boxes than me and my wife, because we just decided early, like, we will go where the opportunity goes. And now that's a little extreme. I wouldn't advise doing that. And it certainly had to slow down as we had kids who started to age into schools. But especially the younger you are, the bigger the reward, the more earnestly you should take the chance to go where the opportunity is, because it does get harder the older you get.
That's when we get like new hires, and I'm talking to them, they're 22, 23. One of the things I tell them is don't buy a lot of crap, because just anticipate you're going to be hauling this stuff with you for the next 15 years of your life. And every time you move apartments or something like that, it's going to be arduous. So keep it lean, go to where the opportunity is, and rewards will follow. I'm obviously a millennial here. I was born in the 90s, and I would say it's pretty apparent that there is a war between the boomers and the millennials going on. And it's kind of, been pervasive over my entire lifetime. And there's often millennials kind of talking about the issues or why they have it uniquely challenging. So what I wanted to kind of present is some of the millennial money myths and have you kind of counter them or show how valid they are. So the first one that millennials often talk about is housing is impossibly expensive and uniquely expensive for their generation. Is that true?
It is. I'll go back to what I said earlier. So this is not the first housing crisis we've had in America, nor is it the worst. And that doesn't make it any easier for anyone who just heard that. So let's talk about the fact that, yes, we have had housing crises. They have been worse. There are lessons from there. I talk about some of these in the book. There are lessons you can learn from previous housing shortages in America. I have an essay, by the way, on this on my Substack specifically addressing this called I Wish I Were Poorer, because I make the point, like, I'm a multimillionaire from real estate in America. This housing shortage has made me rich. I actually don't like that, because I'm an academic and I didn't want the money in the first place. Like, I'm actually just kind of a super nerd who likes reading books. But that's how it turned out for me. And I'm aware that on the other side of that housing shortage is a 32-year-old who's like, how am I ever going to buy a house? Right? And so what do we do with that? And so I talk about some of the lessons of housing shortages in the past. It normally involves doing something you probably didn't want to do. That is how other Americans solve their housing shortage. So I go back to that stat on 1 in 3 Americans changed addresses every year. A lot of that. So you go to New York City in the 1870s and the 1890s. There were, unbelievable housing shortages. There's immigrants are pouring in. There's not enough spaces. The spaces you can rent aren't particularly safe. Anybody who doubts this, go to the Tenement Museum in New York City if you're visiting. That's one of the places, if you're interested in history, you should go to the Tenement Museum because it'll make you realize, oh my gosh, this was normal to live this way not that long ago. All right, so what did people do? One of the things they would do is we just talked about, they would get up and go where the opportunity was. There are places you can buy a house for a reasonable amount. Austin, Texas is one of them. They are building houses in Austin like you would not believe. So one is go where the opportunity is. The other is, if you aren't able to go somewhere else, can you monetize that space? By definition, a housing shortage is a shortage of rentable space. Would you rather be on the ownership side of that shortage or the renting side of that shortage? If you're young and mobile and try to get somewhere, then stay renting. Renting gives you flexibility. But if you're in a stage of life you want to own, can you monetize that space? Now, that's not a very pleasant message for me. I'm not going to make millions of dollars walking around America telling people, you should rent out a room in your house. But that's what actually families did. I have an example in the book of a New York police officer in the 1890s. He is a beat cop. Beat cops then and now don't make a ton of money. He buys a brownstone in New York City. Now, it's not as expensive as today, but it was not cheap. I went back and found the address. Today, it sold for $10 million. Now, it wasn't that expensive, but it was not cheap. How is a New York beat cop, himself, I think, an immigrant or a child of immigrants, affording a brownstone? And the answer is his wife. They immediately started renting out every room in that house for 8 years. 8 years. And she managed all of it. She would manage who was renting. She would do the laundry for them. It was part of the service she provided. Basically rent a bed and breakfast out of their house. 8 years later, they sold it, and they had their own house for the rest of their lives because they had put in those hard 8 years. Nobody wants to hear that. They want to hear how they can buy a beautiful 2,500 square foot house with, a normal payment. And those moments have also happened. Unfortunately, you're not in one of them. So you're going to have to figure out what you do. And the thing is, other Americans lived through the same housing shortages or worse, and they got ahead. So you're going to have to kind of do what they did to leap ahead in ways you may not have thought through.
Next question is, student loans were a promise of higher wages that never seemed to come through. Is this true or false?
I am of the opinion, and it is my opinion. So let's dissect out what is scholarship and. But I think as I look back on the history, there are plenty of eras when people have slid across to them documents to sign. And by law, you should read all that and take the time to sign and make sure you understand what you're getting yourself into. But by practice, as someone who signed paperwork that allowed him to use student loan money to qualify for a mortgage, I am sympathetic to people who are told, just sign here, it'll all work out. There is a line, it's a gray line, we're not always sure what it is, where it becomes predatory. And if you're on the wrong side of that line and you have no recourse, what do you do? And of course people are angry. Of course people are frustrated. Now that said, I'm going to go a little Dave Ramsey on this, which is it's unfortunate. And if your politicians can get you a solution, I'm okay with that solution. That said, it is your problem now and you got to solve it. And the one thing I would tell young people, and I beg them to hear me, as somebody who used to be in $70,000 of student loan debt, in the 2000s, that's closing in on $100K for a degree in history. For a degree that wasn't going to pay out anyway. Nobody had ever told me if you get a degree in history, you're going to be so rich, right? I was dumb enough to not even think about it. My wife and I worked our tails off to pay off that student loan debt. And it was one of the most character-defining phases of my life that I had gotten myself into a hole. The hole was big, and there was nobody who was going to come and rescue me. And it was a character-defining moment to have to start the process of getting out of it. Now, I got very fortunate along the way. Things broke my way. I had some just wonderful opportunities that have fallen in my lap. But all of those would have been equally squandered had we not had the character defining moment of saying, we have to solve this problem. Like, we got ourselves in this mess, and now we got to see our way out. And so, as much as it's tempting to wait for the politicians to rescue you, I have a chapter in the book called The Government Was Always Involved. The government has always been involved in capitalism. That is not new. And maybe the politicians will come up with a solution. But while you wait for rescue, you got to start taking action yourself.
Living standards are decreasing for the first time in a generation. Is this true or false?
Utterly false. And not a single person who heard me say that is going to believe me. Everybody, have you seen this interesting survey that was done fairly recently? I don't remember if it was Gallup or who did it. But they said, like, when was the greatest music? Like, when was the greatest American music era? And for every generation, it was when they were in their 20s to 30s. Or like teens to 20s. It was like whenever your formative years were, that was when American music was great. And so we have this kind of hindsight, rose-colored glasses, whatever you want to call it, that it used to be so good, and now it's gotten so bad, even with music. Here's the reality. If I take you back to 1920, let's go back 100 years. 1 in 3 Americans are technically at or below the poverty line. If I take you to the 1950s, it's 1 in 5. Like, the idea that you could have 20% of Americans living in poverty not that long ago, today it's depending on how you count it, it's between 10 and 16%. Now, I'm all for saying that is 16% too high. But you can't say it's gotten worse, right? So poverty is the lowest rate it's ever been. Let's talk about upward mobility. There is a statistical anomaly of the generation, of the kind of greatest generation in the baby boomers, where they're born to families from the Great Depression, and they end up in this economic boom. So technically, it was easier for them to move into the middle class from where they started. But I have to point out to people, that's because they started in the Great Depression. You gotta factor that, right? It's like saying, well, no baseball team, I can't remember what year it is. It's like the I'm going to butcher it. It's like the Cubs, like the 1908 Cubs or something, have the highest baseball winning percentage ever. I'm like, that's because baseball sucked. But that was, say nobody else was good. All right, so let's look at the upward mobility rate for people of this generation. For the most recent stats that we have, for children born in the bottom, it's called the quintile, the bottom 20%. So children born at the bottom, 6 in 10 will get out of that poverty. So over half. It's not perfect. 8 in 10 would be perfect. That would be perfectly randomized. But it's not terrible. 4 in 10 are going to become middle class, upper middle class, or higher. And 1 in 10 will go from the bottom to the top. Now, if I told your ancestors that 1 in 10 children born for their great-grandchildren's generation would have a chance to go from the very bottom to the very top, they would drop to their knees and say a prayer of thanks in whatever language they used. So by the way, downward mobility is statistically the exact same in the United States as it is in supposedly socialist utopia Denmark. So upward mobility is not perfect in America, but here's the problem. It's not perfect anywhere else either. And so, like, what are we comparing to? And upward mobility, believe it or not, 6 in 10 is higher than it was in the 1800s from going from the bottom into the middle or out of poverty. In the I want to say like 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, like the studies from there, they used to say it was much higher, and then they went back and realized they had not counted minorities and African Americans in the South. And once they incorporated them into the statistics, upward mobility was about 4 in 10. Today, it's about 6 in 10. So actually, we're getting better. Now, that doesn't make anybody feel better who's trying to figure out how to buy a house and why rents are so expensive in New York. But the reality is, you live in the greatest moment. You are starting at a higher plane, and you have a chance to go higher than at any generation in human history. And the only person who's going to get from here to there is you, and you're going to have to do that work, and that's scary. But you'd much rather be a 30-something today than any other decade I could take you to. Like, if I say, do you want to be 30 now, or in 1970 when wages were 30% lower and inflation was 15% and mortgages cost 15%, like, you want to be 30 now. How about, the 1940s? Well, if you want to live through the Depression and fight Nazis, you go right ahead. But like, by the way, an average home in 1950, 900 square feet. Like that's a brand new home. Like, mom and dad had to be real quiet at night to make baby number 3 because babies number 1 and 2 could hear everything. Like you're like, it's a different world. So I could take you back and like, do you want to be 30 here, here, here? Actually, no, you'd pick right now.
Last millennial myth is the boomers ruined everything. Is this true or false?
Oh, they ruined some things. But so look, let's be fair. Let's say that the boomers have been weirdly lucky. So some really great scholarship has been done on this recently. That if you do exactly what the boomers did, work for 40 years, save 10% in stocks, and buy a house, and you run that scenario every year from the American Revolution to yesterday, it would have failed about 40% of the time, like just under half. So yeah, boomers, y'all got lucky. Like what you did didn't always work. So okay, boomer, back off yelling at the young kids that they've got it so easy, all right? But the flip side then has to also be true. Okay, doomer, you're going to have to do what worked the other half of the time. So that's where I hope a book like mine can be helpful, is to remind people that even when the headwinds were in people's face, even when the properties weren't cheap, even when it felt like you had to get up and go where the opportunity was because it wasn't near you, people got ahead anyway. And the lesson of history is pretty clear. People in every era, in every different way, from every ethnic group, found ways to get ahead, even when it wasn't easy. And you can too. And yes, it is easier than it's ever been. That doesn't mean the climb doesn't feel steep to you, but I promise you, you can climb it. And that is one of the clear lessons of the past.
Joseph, I appreciate you. Why don't you share what you've been working on, where people can find you online?
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I hope that people will find it useful. If they do, the book is for sale on all the Amazons out there. It's How to Get Rich in American History, 300 Years of Financial Advice That Worked and Didn't. I also have a Substack, josephmoorebooks.com. You can go there. I write essays like the one we talked about, like I Wish I Was Poor, about the housing crisis. I wrote one called Bitcoin is a Zeppelin, explaining what I think is going to happen, the history lessons for Bitcoin. So I kind of write about these topics, about life and money, and I call it History Helps. Like, can we make history be helpful? So you're welcome to find me there. And if you sign up, I'll send you a free copy of chapter 1 of my book in your inbox so you can decide if this is a book for you.
Awesome. Joseph Moore, thank you so much.
Hey, enjoyed it.